Hello and welcome back to Documentary Film, and here we are already in Module 5. And this week's film is a real hybrid of different modes of documentary. The Fog of War, that's the film we're going to be looking at, our feature presentation, as they say. Now, when we talk about modes of documentary, we've talked about essentially 6 in the past, and that's really the 6 main ones that Bill Nichols talks about: poetic, expository, participatory, observational, reflective, and performative. Today's film intersects on a number of different levels. At times it is very poetic. There are some beautiful images that are used to either comment or contradict the voice that we hear on the screen that belongs to Robert McNamara, who is the main individual that is being interviewed. So in that sense, it's poetic in terms of its images. It appears to be an expository voice of God film, but there's something else that's going on. There's something very reflective about the film, and that's what makes this expository appearance very problematic. So when we talk about reflective, right, we talk about self-reflexive, self-reflective, challenging our ability to capture or tell the truth using film, an awareness that all media is a construct, whether it's a mockumentary or otherwise. So the main focus of this film is truth-telling, and whether or not a person can be telling the truth even while being filmed. So the film is poetic. The film is also participatory because we see Robert McNamara on the screen. We hear Errol Morris kind of behind the scenes or just off frame asking questions. So the encounter with the filmmaker and the main characters is clearly there. There's interaction that then forms the content of the film, so that's also very important. One of the most intriguing things about the Fog of War is breaking the fourth wall. McNamara stares right at us. What he's actually doing is staring into a camera. But the camera is set up using an interrotron that we're going to talk about in a moment that allows McNamara to appear to be looking right at us when in fact he's looking off camera to Errol Morris. So the structure of the film reflects the degree of participation that the main character, Robert McNamara, has with the filmmaker and with the audience. So it's a direct address, we could call it. We'll talk a little bit more about cinema verite or truth cinema. The notion of using the camera to provoke and reveal. Therein lies that problematic, because yes, it's participatory. The person who is speaking is allegedly telling the truth. They are answering the questions to the best of their ability. But there's a very deep reflective tone in this film that we need to consider. And that's really what I want you to think about as as you watch the film. Now, I've added in this first slide that is a definition of historical revisionism, and we're just going to kind of quickly go through it. So what is that? Historical revisionism is the means by which the historical record or the history of a society, as understood as its collective memory, what all of us remember, we either experienced directly, indirectly, through the media and so on, but it is that collective memory that we have in a particular community that is continually integrating new facts, and this is the important one, interpretations of the events that are commonly understood as history. So revisionism is a means by which a historical record is now being revised and changed with new facts which sound more objective, but what is more problematic is the interpretation of those facts, the interpretations of the events that are commonly understood as history. Now, typically this is done by individuals who are considered dispossessed, disenfranchised, marginalized, in the minority, and this is where historical revisionism can be very, very useful. So anyone that's working outside the mainstream or has been marginalized in the past is able to challenge the status quo, challenge this common collective memory that individuals have of a particular event. So it ends here in the friction between mainstream of accepted beliefs and the new perspectives of historical revisionism. Received historical ideas are either changed, solidified, or clarified. If over a period of time the revisionist ideas become the new establishment status quo, what's called a paradigm shift occurs. So this is typically with individuals writing about history. It can also sometimes be those individuals who lived that history. And this is what we have in this film. Robert McNamara had a direct hand in the involvement in World War II and in the Vietnam War via the American government. So he is not a historian. He is the person upon which many historians write about. So he would be the person that could set the record straight, as they say, quote unquote. But what happens in the film is something actually quite different. And that's what makes this film rather interesting, because Errol Morris basically goes to the source, and the source is kind of busy reconstituting and reinterpreting the facts of history to present a certain agenda. In other words, to try to present himself as someone that maybe was not as bad as we had kind of painted him to be. Because Errol Morris, the director of the film, is quoted as saying, "People who grew up during the Vietnam War are disinclined even to listen to McNamara no matter what he says. All right, this guy was bad news. This is a guy that basically continued the war in Vietnam, escalated it, and now is trying to revise history to make it sound like, he was all about peace." Well, this is the person that did it, and now we've got to take his word on it. Has he thought about it and reflected and changed his mind? Now, how do we sort of square that circle and say, well, he thought about what he did and changed his mind, but the facts need to speak for themselves. So those who grew up during the Vietnam War, that were drafted or conscripted into the war, didn't want to be there, suffered, harm, or family members died there. No matter what McNamara says, they're going to hate him, period. Now, people who are much younger, Morris goes on, who know nothing about Vietnam, come to the film without really strong feelings of one way or another about this man. So they're just going to watch the film and listen to what he says. So he finishes, "I would say, though, for both generations, regardless of what McNamara has done in the past, he's lived through and has been part of a lot of 20th century history." And this is true. He has, because he's an individual that would be considered a very valuable source. Historians sat with him and quizzed him on all kinds of things. But what's happening is the source of these events, right? Specifically the involvement in the Vietnam War with Americans, the person that was in charge of it now has not second thoughts about what they did, because usually second thoughts are before the facts occur. He's having a renewed interpretation of his behavior, and more important, his intentions. So individuals can certainly do that. But again, how do we reconcile a person's misunderstanding of their original intentions versus what they actually did? And that's really what makes this film rich. If you know anything about the Vietnam War, and you can certainly Google it, there's lots of stuff. It was a messy, protracted civil war between North and South Vietnam, and the French government, which was a colonial power then back in the 1950s, realized that this was going to be a mess. So they wanted to kind of pull out as quickly as they could, but could not leave a power vacuum. So what they did is they managed to get the Americans involved as peacekeepers and let's say sort of people that could sort of direct this shift in power from the French colonizing powers, the imperialist powers, and the new Vietnamese power. So in that process, a civil war occurred. So suddenly the American, the individuals that were there to consult, they were basically consultants. Very slowly but surely, they became more and more involved in the war on behalf of South Vietnam. And the reason why was because North Vietnam was now being funded by China. So there was this alleged communist threat, and this notion that if the Americans were to let Vietnam go, it would be like dominoes. There'd be one country after another that would fall to communist rule. Well, it didn't happen. It didn't. And all that's happened with Vietnam is the North finally in 1975 overran South Vietnam. Now there were re-education camps. There was the absolutely brutal ruling of Pol Pot, who was the leader at this point. And eventually things began to settle down because no matter what happens, a country needs to trade. A country needs to export and import goods because otherwise it just dies away. So over a period of time, Americans came back and were able to redress the balance away from pure communist rule towards a kind of mixed economy. Politically and economically, it was a kind of a mixture between left and right. So that's essentially the entire story. But what McNamara is valuable for was the escalation of the Vietnam War, especially in the 1960s. But we hear him in the film to listen to him, he has very different views about his actions. Now, he also has very different views about his actions during the Second World War as well, especially the attack on Japan, or attacks in the plural on Japan. Now, I mentioned that this film is participatory. It breaks the fourth wall, and it does so using this interesting device here, this interrotron. So what happens is we have the individual that is being interviewed right here, and they are staring at a picture right there, the screen, of the person that is interviewing them. So what's happening is, in the same way as I'm looking at this camera, when McNamara is speaking to Errol Morris, the interviewer, it appears that we are taking the place of Morris because McNamara is looking straight at us. So he breaks the fourth wall. This is something that is not typically done in films. Now, it actually looks like this, where we've got the filmmaker, the director here, the person being interviewed over there, and the end result is it looks something like that. So you have the person that is being spoken to. We see the person that is doing the interviewing right there. But the way the camera is set up, the effect is that the person being interviewed looks straight into the camera. So that's called the interrotron. Kind of a interesting sort of word, but that's what it means. It's simply, in fact, last time I checked, it was one of the very few films to use it. In fact, I think it was devised by Errol Morris, so he may have a copyright, I don't know. But that's what that is. That's what makes that film look as unusual as it does, because McNamara looks us straight in the eye. So it's quite compelling. So the style of the film, like I said, it's again, to be very clear, it appears to be expository, but it really isn't, because it's also reflective. What Morris is asking us to consider is the veracity, the truth of what is being discussed. And that is very important because what is being discussed are facts. It's McNamara's interpretation of those facts that Morris wishes to question. Neither are disputing the facts occurred. What they are disputing are the interpretations that McNamara has of his own behavior and his own decisions, and what we, because Morris is part of that collective consciousness, right, the collective memory, he's now trying to set up either contradictory images or at least contradictory evidence of some sort. So we have an agreement on the facts. This happened on this day, these events, but it's the interpretation. McNamara wants to kind of backpedal or soft pedal the intentionality of these actions, that they were, in fact, to kill 100,000 Japanese, to bring them to their knees so they would surrender. And this was before the 2 atomic bombs were dropped. So what McNamara is doing is trying to soft pedal the degree of cruelty and carnage that occurred towards the tail end of the Second World War, and also in Vietnam, in a sense to make him look better. But let's face it, it's probably also to make himself feel better, because I don't know how you could live with the knowledge that you are responsible for killing hundreds of thousands of people. Now, American casualties in Vietnam, I believe, is 54,000. I think that's, for some reason, that number sticks in my head, around 54,000. Now, we've lost close to 470,000 people to COVID, and no one bats an eye. So what we're having here is a reinterpretation about the intentions behind the maneuvers that the American government, engaged in to accelerate this war, to increase the carnage. And Morris is trying to question the truth content of the interpretation by presenting us with visuals that quite often contradict what's being said. So he says on the style, on the one hand, you have a subjective account, a person giving an intensely subjective account of his experience, which is clearly what the film is about. And on the other hand, I'm littering this account with, which is a rather phrase, I'm just throwing this stuff out. No, it is very carefully edited. There's no littering, not at all. In fact, watching the images, the sometimes very poetic images, there is a very calculated effect that's being sought after. And again, when you think about Eisenstein, right, tonal, overtonal, and intellectual montage, that's kind of what's going on. That's kind of what he's doing. So he isn't just littering these images. He's being very strategic in placing certain images to undercut certain comments made by McNamara. So he says, on the other hand, I'm littering this account with objective evidence, right, facts, whether it's presidential recordings, documents, historical clips that take you back to the events themselves. So once again, I stress, there's no disagreement that the events occurred. There is disagreement on the interpretation of those events that actually occurred, those historical events. So there is a mixture of the intensely objective and the intensely subjective without a whole lot in between. What's in between is us, right? What's in between is the viewer. We having to sort through this and decide for ourselves what is truth and what is interpretation. And ultimately, truth is provisional. Truth is subjective. Truth is a whole range of different interpretations of what may have happened based on understanding, education, willingness to sort through all kinds of extraneous facts to get at the heart, of the core of the matter. So it is a stylistic choice, it's true, but it's a very interesting one because it is a highly self-reflexive film. The filmmaker is asking us to reflect on the truth content of this film, and he himself is undercutting the ability to tell the truth by saying, well, look, here's my evidence. And McNamara says, okay, there's my evidence, right? Here's what I think is happening. So what is the style of the film? Well, the style of the film is this strange hybrid of participatory and reflexive cinema. That's kind of primarily its two modes, right? It's poetic, yes, but it is participatory and reflective above all else. And this is really a film that highlights the way in which these modes can coexist and not contradict each other, actually kind of enhance one another, because you can be participatory, but you could also be reflective of the truth content of what's being discussed. It makes for a very rich cinematic experience. Now, there's also the notion of the editing. There's a whole range of different sort of cinematic tricks that are going on. A lot of stock footage. Now, again, it isn't just any stock footage. It is stock footage directly related to what McNamara is talking about. So it isn't just sort of thrown there to just take up space. These are there to either enhance what McNamara is saying or to undercut it. So it does shift back and forth between this kind of subjective viewpoint and something resembling an objective viewpoint. And objectivity, always sort of put that in quotation marks, such as truth and reality. So those words, objectivity, truth, reality, those are very difficult things to not only carve out and create, but to maintain. Because there are always other opinions that are going to be coming down at a later date to allow us to reformulate a new opinion, reformulate a new interpretation about those events. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it is a struggle between these two poles of subjectivity and objectivity. The events occurred. It is the interpretation of the events that are kind of at loggerheads here between Morris's representation of us, that collective consciousness, and of course he backs it up with images that are presented as factual, right? recordings and footage. And then there's McNamara, who is, well, should be objective. He was there. A fact's a fact. But what's interesting is his interpretation, his spin on his behavior, a new understanding of his intentions. So that's really kind of what's going on. Now, the music in this film by Philip Glass. Philip Glass also worked with Errol Morris on A Thin Blue Line, and I think a couple of other films. Really interesting, almost kind of mechanical sounding. It kind of builds and builds, and really sets the tone. I'm just going to look very quickly through my notes here, because when I watched through it, I was trying to think of some information here. But Philip Glass is a very important composer, American composer. Oh man, because the one time I can't find anything here. Okay, anyway, it's very effective. It really gives the film a certain tone. Now, we'll go back as I'm looking here. Apply the style to a larger argument. Is a film presenting two opposing arguments? Well, like I was saying, what it's trying to do is to present objectivity in a subjective way and subjectivity in an objective way. In other words, the subjectivity of the filmmaker and the main character, we'll call him, Robert McNamara, is presented through a visual construct. Now, the construct itself is objective. It's a film, but everything about it is subjective. The length of shots, the degree of closeness that the camera has to McNamara, and most importantly is all that stock footage, all that important footage that either reinforces or undercuts what McNamara is saying. So the style of the film is a struggle between subjectivity and accepting it, because that has to do with interpretation, understanding intentionality, agency, and all these other kinds of words. But there's also, at what point do we say this objectively happened? We can agree that the event occurred, but the why, right? We can understand what happened. We might understand how it happened. But what's really up for grabs in terms of truth and reality is why it happened. And interpretation is about why something happened. And therein lies that conundrum, that kind of quicksand that the film presents to us in a really interesting way. So what Errol Morris eventually does is he shows to us that McNamara is very much aware of his very important role in 20th century American political history. And he seems to be kind of wrestling out loud and interpreting and reinterpreting his behavior, because the participation that he gave to the American government is primarily about war. So is that something to be proud of? I mean, yes, we won the war, but look at how many people you killed. I mean, hundreds of thousands in Japan alone, not even talking about the deaths in Vietnam. So what's happening here is McNamara is holding these two sort of beliefs. He is aware that he's guilty of many, carnage and so on. He feels guilt about what he has done to make a difference. He's almost atoning. Atoning is typically when you atone for one's sins. You almost beg forgiveness, right? You atone, you admit that you've done it, but you now are asking for forgiveness. And that's kind of what is at the heart of this film. There's a certain amount of pathos in not pathetic, but pathos, kind of a degree of sadness in McNamara's almost self-awareness of his, let's say, somewhat negative role in U.S. government history, political history, because of his association with the end of the Second World War, the atomic bombs dropped on Japan, the absolute almost burning to a cinder of most of Japan itself, most of the urban centers, and then not even, roughly 20 years later, from 45 to 65, to become involved in the Vietnam War. So he is almost atoning for the sins that he's inflicted on others. And he does feel guilt, but it's how he articulates that guilt. It's how he unpacks that guilt and asking us to understand his revised interpretation of what he was doing. So it is a person confessing, right? It's a kind of confessional film. Again, Morris and McNamara don't have a disagreement regarding the events, right? The what and the how. It's the why. It's the why that is much more important. So the response to the film, as you can imagine, when you're trying to create a film like that about the Vietnam War, McNamara, his role in it, there are some people, some critics, that thought that Morris was too easy on McNamara, and others who thought it was too hard on him. Now, I will leave it up to you to decide whether Morris pressed McNamara hard enough. But certainly, I would think, and I cannot speak for Morris alone, but having seen the film a couple of times, I would say that Morris wanted to put McNamara in a position of comfort. This is kind of a good cop, bad cop sort of thing, where if you have the good cop come in and you try to reason with that person, you get them to lower their defenses, you can now speak to them and engage them. I think ultimately it makes a better film. So for those that say he went too easy on him, yes, he may have. But if he had gone too hard on him, I think the film would have sounded and looked very different for all kinds of reasons. Because I believe McNamara felt a kind of kinship with Morris to say, I can confide in you, knowing full well he's being filmed. But that sense of atonement, that sense of guilt, that sense of asking for forgiveness for what he did, again, no disagreement on the facts, but great disagreement on the interpretation of why those events occurred. So I would leave it up to you. You tell me how you think the film sort of plays out in terms of the way Morris deals with McNamara. I think that by going a little bit soft on him at first, he kind of warms up to Morris and opens up as a result. Because in this case, the good cop version worked out in our favor. McNamara reveals many things about himself. Now, what McNamara is also trying to do is, although he may be confessing and atoning, he also wishes to have some degree of control in the conversation, the kinds of questions being asked, and the pacing of the film. Because really, his voice, his words, his sentiments are the structure of the film. The film is built entirely around his wording. Now, that is typically an expository narrative film where the voice of God is truth and the images work at the service of the words. Not here. Morris is trying to either emphasize his words sometimes, but also just as often undercut what he's saying. So we cannot say this is an expository film because there is a disconnect, right? A disjunction between the images being shown versus the voice that we're hearing. Because we often see McNamara speaking, we also hear him in the voiceover. We know it's the same person, but he, although he's trying to control the narrative, really doesn't in the end, because not in a typical expository fashion. We see him when he's talking to journalists. The very first clip, he's sort of putting up a big map, and he starts asking, hey, is everything okay? Is the screen too high? The camera's ready to go. He, right from the get-go, wishes to take control of the situation. So he can not necessarily call the shots, but he wants to at least have some degree of control as to how this thing will play out, how this narrative is going to unfold. So the quote here now, I remember exactly the sentence I left off on. I remember how it started, and I was cut off in the middle, but how can you fix it up in some way? When Morris begins questioning about his involvement in Vietnam, McNamara diverts back to his time at Ford, a time when he was saving lives. Because here's a really odd thing about McNamara. When he was working for the Ford Motor Company, he was coming up with things like collapsible steering wheels, seat belts, things that were saving lives. And yet this same person works for the American government basically as a warmonger. So which McNamara do we believe? And so this is a part of the film, and it's quite early on because he talks about Vietnam, and then we kind of sort of set the record straight, and we go even further back. We start with the Second World War. But even in a statement like that, I remember exactly the sentence I left off on. Okay, then he picks up the thread. So there are times, multiple times, that McNamara tries to divert the question or a response so that he either doesn't deal with it directly or can deal with it at a later point after he's kind of set us up so that we can think differently about what he was doing. Now, McNamara remembers some really odd things. Yes, he saved lives while working at Ford Motor Company, also took a lot of lives while working for the American government, but apparently Robert McNamara tells us that he remembers at the end of World War I, when he was only 2 years old. Somehow he remembers the end of the First World War. So he would have been, he was born in 1916, because the war was finished in 1918. So at the age of 2, at a time when most kids are barely able to speak, not really cognizant of their surroundings, somehow Robert Strange McNamara was able to remember the end of the First World War. Okay, do we trust that perspective? Why is that? Why would Morris include that in the film? You can think about that. It could be a way of McNamara being able to say that, my memory is razor sharp. I remember everything, all the way back to the age of 2. Well, most of us who know about things that happened to us when we were 2 or 3 or even 5 don't remember directly. We remember because our family members, our parents, told us about it. Do you remember when you were 2 or 3 and you did this? Well, sure, okay. Well, you don't truly. But over time, you internalize this memory, and eventually you begin to think that that actually did occur, that you did actually remember at the age of 2, the end of World War I. Okay, we don't know. But the fact that McNamara presents it to us, and of course it's a fact about war, remembrance about war, which is certainly ironic, but could he have actually remembered something at the age of 2? But there it is. It's something that Morris does include for us to maybe question the intent, the veracity, the truth content of his memory, because at this point, maybe that's another one that we shouldn't be so quick to embrace and go, of course he remembered. So McNamara also tells us he's not sure about his involvement in the firebombing of the Japanese cities. And then what does Morris offer to counter this perspective? Well, facts. Morris presents us with facts. So McNamara says, he's not really quite sure. I remember the end of World War I when I was 2, but I don't quite remember my involvement in the Japanese bombings. And Morris is showing us details. He's showing his signature on documents regarding the bombing of Japanese cities. So who are you going to believe, right? Now, it is possible to not remember something, but Morris puts this little nugget in at the very beginning saying, I remember the end of World War I when I was 2 years old. And then when you were, let's say, in your 30s, I don't remember doing that. And Morris says, well, you should. Here are the facts. So there's that struggle between subjectivity and objectivity, truth versus interpretation. So all the way through the film, it's constructed this way. The movie's epilogue shows McNamara driving Washington rather than facing the Interrotron, right, facing his interviewer. The voice is from a phone interview. What do you think of it? I'll let you decide. What do you think the significance of that final scene is? Because he's in his car, right? We see him in his car. We hear a voiceover, which is a phone recording, a phone message. I won't say what it is, but think of that ending and how it differs from the rest of the film, and more importantly, why that would be. So, ultimately, Morris is the one who's in control of the narrative, and he's the one in control of the degree to which we're going to believe that what we see on the screen or what we hear coming out of McNamara's mouth is the truth. So, there are dozens and dozens of images of not just stock footage, but specific footage related to the event that is being discussed. Now, there is, for example, again, this is when it gets poetic, images of numbers that are fluttering down on an aerial photograph of Tokyo. These images are poetic, but they really comment on what's being discussed. And what it is being discussed is, for example, the number of bombs that were dropped, these firebombs that were dropped on Tokyo, Hiroshima, many of the urban centers in Japan. And that's what these numbers are showing, right? This is how many were dropped. So it visualizes the information that is being told to us, to our ears, through the voice, and now Morris renders it as a visual. So it's a really interesting and a very poetic and cinematic kind of way of presenting what could be otherwise, sometimes very dry information, but very, very effective. So some certain questions for you to think about. What does McNamara want us to believe? Well, short answer, he wants us to believe him. And he doesn't have control ultimately over the film. He may have had control over the interview, but Morris could still re-edit and chop up that interview in a whole different range, to make him sound stupid or forgetful or whatever. What McNamara himself during the interview wants us to believe is clearly that he does feel a degree of guilt. He is trying to, engage in some degree of atonement for what he has done. But what he's asking us to do is reimagine, reinterpret these events that he was directly involved with or involved in and responsible for. But he's trying to kind of perform a sort of historical revisionism. That's sort of what's going on here. So ask yourself, is he explaining history as he remembers it or telling us what he wants us to think? So how is he, well, I don't want to say manipulate. How is he asking us to interpret the events? Because that's a really important question. Is he explaining history as he remembers it? Remember, the age of 2, he remembers the end of World War I, quite remarkable. Or is he telling us what he wants us to think? In telling us what he thinks, he seems to imply that this should be the interpretation that is the right one. This is the truthful one. This is me thinking about this this event, because it is a film, thinking of this event over a period of time, and I should allow myself to, change my opinion, to reinterpret these things. Now, does McNamara understand the difference between his memory of an event and his interpretation of an event? Because those two things are at work, sometimes in a very subtle way, sometimes in a very explicit and overt kind of way. So we have to ask ourselves, do we know whether he can tell the difference, or can we even? Are we listening carefully to what he's saying? Now, of course, at your age, none of you were around during the Vietnam War, I would think, certainly not the Second World War. So we have to rely to a certain degree on McNamara's words, right? This is what we've got. So we have to take him at his word, and Morris does not. He doesn't take him at his word. He does the research, and he says, okay, look, this is the historical fact that you are discussing, and here is the why it happened. The why it happened doesn't match up with what you're saying. So it really is a kind of exercise in truth-telling, because truth-telling has much to do with interpretation as it does with maintaining some understanding of reality, because each of us have got slightly different interpretations of what reality is, what truth is. Now, do we allow McNamara that latitude, that difference between memory and interpretation? Or should that not be allowed when we were talking about historical facts? Because that is something that is really important. When we talk about a personal event, in our immediate family, there may be 5 people that saw it, and each one will have an ever so slightly different version, because no one ever understands intentionality except the person who did it. And sometimes even they are not 100% sure why they did something. So when we talk about the memory of an event versus the interpretation of that event versus the intentionality behind that event occurring, all those things really problematize truth-telling. So a quote, "I'm not going to say any more than I have. You don't know what I know about how inflammatory my words can appear. Is it the feeling that you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, no matter what?" asks Morris. "Yeah, that's right. And I'd rather be damned if I don't." Okay, so McNamara is very much aware of what he's doing. But there is this degree of atonement and contrition and asking for a kind of forgiveness. Now, I'm not saying he says it explicitly. He's not saying, please forgive me. But he presents an interpretation of historical events that he was directly involved in, but in a way that is asking us to embrace his version of it. But if we were never there, right, how do we know that there is a truthful version? Is Morris's version any better, right? All Morris is doing is presenting to us documents, whether they are recordings or, photographs or images and so on, like film. Both are engaged in the same sort of truth-telling. It is still a struggle. So ultimately, there is a degree of uncertainty in the film. Now, you don't walk away utterly confused, trust me. But what is happening is you really now have to think more carefully as to the facts that are being presented and discussed. So the film questions how we know what we know. Because if we don't think about the source of our information, the source of our knowledge, we end up gullible, right? As we shut down more and more newspapers, and in its place is basically garbage on YouTube and all kinds of social media platforms. Yeah, it's no bloody wonder people don't know what's going on and are just formulating their own opinions, or as they usually are, doing research on YouTube and simply finding things that correspond with what they believe in. So the film questions how we know what we know. Are we 100% sure these events occurred? If we can prove conclusively, historically, with either scientific documentation or scientific evidence or literature or whatever, yeah, it is possible to come to some tentative conclusion to say, well, yes, it happened. So there is also a degree of confusion sometimes. There is sometimes a sense of self-deception. McNamara may be deceiving himself in his interpretation. So when I say he's looking for atonement and contrition and forgiveness, that's not consistently all the way through. They do kind of pop out periodically. There are certain looks in his eye, especially when the camera holds on his face. Like that face really reveals a lot because he looks, like please forgive me. Several times you'll see that. At a time when a director would simply just call cut or could end that shot, Morris holds it just for a few extra seconds. And we can see that McNamara has a really strong intent to have us embrace and believe in the version of events that he is presenting to us. So there is sometimes self-deception. Sometimes there is, very straightforward, factual presentation of events. But there is a whole range of sort of sliding scales back and forth on this thing. So ultimately, because we're talking about propaganda, right, we have to ask ourselves, how does a film both challenge and illustrate the effects of propaganda? Now, one of the main things with propaganda is its simple message, right? It is simplistic. It is one message hammered over and over and over again with no positive alternative. And if there is any alternative presented, it is presented as a negative idea, something you do not want to do or should not do. So propaganda is very basic, very straightforward. The message is simple because propaganda is not about complexity. It's not about nuance by any means. So the film does, in fact, challenge the ability of propaganda to work effectively, because if McNamara is propagandizing to us and asking us to accept his point of view, Morris is busy undercutting any possibility of that happening. And that's kind of what makes the film really interesting. So there are some lies that are told straight out by McNamara in the film. He talks about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, another almost declaration of war by the Americans towards Cuba. So he says, Kennedy was trying to keep us out of war, he tells Morris. I was trying to help him keep us out of war. Well, it turns out that McNamara was an advocate for peace for maybe the first 2 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis in, I believe, 1961, if my memory serves me right. I was 1 year old. But very shortly after, he was advocating for war. So McNamara's memory of this, of these events, well, he remembered things that were going on when he was 2, the end of World War I, and somehow as an adult isn't quite sure what happened. Well, no, of course he is. He knows that after 2 days he was advocating for war, but he doesn't want to end up being presented as a warmonger in the history books, because when he speaks to Morris and indirectly speaks to us through that camera, he's also speaking to historians. He's also speaking to his place in history. And so, yes, he may have been advocating for peace for the first 48 hours of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I think lasted, if I remember correctly, maybe 2 weeks at the most, a very short time. But very quickly, McNamara was all about war. And John F. Kennedy, he wanted to see to removing American missiles from Turkey in order to get Khrushchev, Nikolai Khrushchev, who was then the premier of the USSR, what is now back to being called Russia. So Kennedy was willing to remove American missiles from Turkey, pointed to the USSR, in order to get Khrushchev to back off in Cuba. So by doing that, it would ease pressure off the Soviet, we'll say Russia, just to be safe. So Khrushchev was willing to accept not putting missiles on Cuban soil, provided Kennedy took his missiles, American missiles, off Turkish soil that were aimed at Russia. And so no matter what, the Americans weren't about to lose a whole lot, because there were very few missiles aimed at the U.S. At that particular time, because the issue was the possibility that there could have been some on Cuba. And if there were a few, they weren't there for very long. So the U.S. was really always, fighting from a position of strength. So another issue, the Gulf of Tonkin, which is a very important, sort of almost a turning point. In fact, most historians consider the attack of the Gulf of Tonkin against the Maddox, which is the boat, the attack possibly, again, here's an event that is looked at by historians as a turning point of the war, the American involvement in Vietnam. So in the Gulf of Tonkin, the USS Maddox is attacked by torpedoes, maybe North Vietnamese torpedoes. And then we find out that when the Maddox sort of relay this information to federal forces, it turned out that, it didn't quite happen in exactly the way that we presented it. Those exact hours, well, it's kind of more or less what's going on. So here is a world-changing event, an attack on a U.S. ship in a Vietnamese Gulf, possibly by North Vietnamese torpedoes, something pretty important. And even here, there is doubt whether or not these torpedoes had come from the North Vietnamese, exactly the timeline of these events occurring, because here's what had been going on. And as it says here, the Maddox had been attacking the North Vietnamese coastline for days. So even though they were not officially involved in the war, they were still attacking North Vietnamese defenses. So it was hardly a surprise that the North Vietnamese would finally retaliate. But the timeline is that the Maddox fired first. So the notion of officially entering into war after the attack is wrong. That's why that timeline is so important. Only after did we find out that, no, they had been busy attacking North Vietnamese positions and they retaliated. Okay, so kind of changes things, doesn't it? So when asked about this, McNamara responds with, well, our Navy played no part in it, was not associated with, was not aware of any South Vietnamese actions, if there weren't any. Oh, okay, so South Vietnamese were also firing rockets. So the USS Maddox firing on North Vietnamese positions, the South Vietnamese doing the same thing. And so regardless of exactly when U.S. involvement began, even those in the know, even those that officially made that pronouncement, were lying to us. And the USS Maddox was already engaged in warfare before they turned around and said, yes, we're officially in. They were already in. So even the sources are lying to us. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting in the film as we watch it is this kind of it's sort of a device. It's a series of lessons, and these lessons they are basically sort of little captions. You know, empathize with your enemy. Rationality will not save you. There's something beyond oneself. Maximize efficiency, and so on. And so these are basically ways in which the film structures itself, because it does bounce around the very beginning, because it starts with 1962, then it jumps to 1992, then back to 1918 when McNamara says, oh, I remember when I was 2 years old, and so on. So it kind of jumps around a fair bit. But these kind of lessons are kind of the kind of signposts for us to think about what we're seeing. So what I'm going to end with, though, is just a little bit of information regarding the film. Excuse me. Okay, so the film's concept, this is not in the books. I'm just going to read it to you. So, using archival footage, United States cabinet conversation recordings, and an interview with the then 85-year-old Robert McNamara, The Fog of War depicts Robert McNamara's life from his birth during the First World War, remembering the time American troops returned from Europe, to working as a World War II whiz-kid military officer, to being the Ford Motor Company president, then to serving as Secretary of Defense for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, including his involvement in the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War. So a pretty full agenda. Very busy boy. So in a 2004 appearance in Berkeley, Errol Morris said his inspiration for the documentary derived from McNamara's book, Wilson's Ghost, Reducing the Risk of Conflict, Killings, and Catastrophe in the 21st Century. So there's already that atonement, right? Reducing the risk, not increasing or, give them hell, Harry, bomb them back to the Stone Age. No, reducing the risk of conflict. Okay, Morris originally approached McNamara for an interview for an hour-long television special. This was extended multiple times before Morris decided to turn the project into a feature film. So Morris interviewed McNamara for almost 20 hours. The 2-hour documentary comprises 11 lessons, originally taken from, in retrospect, The Tragedy and Lessons of Vietnam. This would be a documentary, made in 1995. And he reflects on these lessons in interviews that comprise The Fog of War. Interestingly, at the Berkeley event, McNamara disagreed with Morris's interpretation in The Fog of War. Yet in completion of the film, McNamara supplemented the original 11 lessons with an additional 10 more lessons. Those can be found on the Fog of War DVD. So that's essentially it. So if you can say there's a plot in this film, it is the following. The film is constructed around interviews with McNamara by director Errol Morris through this special device called the Interrotron, which projects images of the interviewer and interviewee on two-way mirrors in front of the respective cameras, so that each appears to be talking directly to one another, or at least directly to us. Use of this device is intended to convey actual interaction with each other and direct eye contact with the viewer. In other words, breaking that fourth wall. In the film, McNamara talks about aspects of international security and how and by what means it can be influenced by many different circumstances. And that's essentially what those 11 lessons contain. So, the documentary explores recent events in American history, such as the Vietnam War, but it also focuses on McNamara's life and how he rose from a humble American family to be a politician who achieved enormous power and influence. McNamara worked with Presidents John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, and with General Curtis LeMay. His opinions and personal experience learned while serving as a Secretary of Defense provide the viewer with enlightening philosophical lessons on American foreign policy. The documentary covers important events such as World War II, the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and many others that McNamara himself witnessed. So he was there. McNamara is regarded as the architect of the Vietnam War, a war that cost an enormous number of lives, 54,000 I believe, against a foe whose resolve he seriously underestimated. McNamara's interview, along with archival footage, offers a close look at international security and the international relations of the U.S. and an insight into why certain conflicts occur and the lessons that can be learned from these conflicts. So there is some sort of information that has to do with strategies that we can use to avoid conflict, which is a surprising thought coming from McNamara, given his association with not one but two world wars and the Cuban Missile Crisis. But still, people can change their minds. People can atone. People can turn a page and think differently about themselves. So I think McNamara is doing that. He's contrite. He's atoning for his behavior, but in so doing, quite often reinterprets events that we understand them as occurring in one way, and in fact, to his mind, not the how and the what, but the why of the event. He now is asking us to embrace his reinterpretation. So a difference in his intentionality at the time and what he thinks of it now. So an interesting film, very rich with all kinds of ideas, and really ultimately it does problematize and question the notion of an expository film where we have a narrator, the voice of God, telling us information, giving us alleged facts, but how usually with the expository form, the images are at the service of the voice. Here, they undercut the voice. They question the voice. They render that voice problematic. That's what makes this film so interesting. So enjoy it, and hopefully, please, people, come by on Wednesday, because last time I did a video basically staring at a wall, and that's no fun. Last thing, a couple of people are still contacting me regarding answers for the viewing quiz. Do not worry if you only get 0 or 1 out of 10 or 11. I go in and mark those questions. I mark those answers. So typically when I go back in there, I can salvage several marks. And most people answer these questions correctly. It's just a way that you phrased your answer. It doesn't match up with FOL. It's up to me. So I go in after the fact. Now, again, please save your answers. I had one person not save anything, and I don't know whether they didn't know how to or they just forgot or whatever, but always save your answers. So have a good weekend. It's Sunday afternoon. Here it's 4 o'clock, but we'll see each other, I hope, on Wednesday at noon hour, and we can talk a little bit more about the fog of war. So take care, and we'll see